She walked into that reunion carrying 15 years of silence, and every cruel whisper those people ever thought she'd forgotten. They laughed at her dress. They laughed at her weight. They laughed at the empty chair beside her and called it proof of everything they always believed about Nia Brooks. Then the doors opened, and Chicago stopped breathing. Before I tell you what happened next, if you've ever been underestimated, mocked, or told you weren't enough, this story is for you. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and comment your city below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me. Every single second of this is worth it. The dress was the wrong choice. Nia knew it the moment she stepped out of the cab and felt the October wind cut straight through the thin fabric, raising goosebumps along her arms and reminding her body of something her mind had been trying to ignore for 3 weeks. That coming back here was a mistake. The Grand Meridian Hotel rose above Michigan Avenue like it had always been there and always would be, its limestone facade lit gold against the early evening sky. The kind of building that made certain people feel like they belonged and made everyone else feel the opposite. Nia stood on the sidewalk with her small black purse clutched in both hands and looked up at the revolving doors. People moved through them in pairs, in clusters, laughing already, wearing things that cost more than her first car. She could hear the low rumble of a live band warming up inside, something jazzy and confident, the kind of music that assumed everyone listening was having a good time. She hadn't told Dominic about the reunion until 4 days ago. That had been deliberate. He'd been in the middle of what he called a restructuring. She had learned long ago not to ask for details when he used that word, and she hadn't wanted to pull him away from something that clearly required his full attention. More than that, if she was honest with herself standing here on this cold sidewalk, she hadn't wanted to need him there. That need felt like a confession. It felt like admitting that 15 years hadn't been enough to grow past the girl who used to eat lunch alone in the east stairwell because the cafeteria was too dangerous. She took a breath and walked through the revolving doors. The lobby hit her like a physical thing. Warm air, expensive perfume, the murmur of 200 voices polished into something that sounded almost like civility. Round tables draped in white linen filled a ballroom visible through open double doors. A banner stretched across the back wall read, Lincoln Park Preparatory, Class Reunion, in block letters that looked cheerful in a way that felt vaguely threatening. Photo boards covered a folding partition near the entrance. Class pictures arranged in chronological order, faces frozen in that particular teenage expression that thinks it knows everything. Nia found herself in the second row of the sophomore photo before she found the coat check. 14 years old, hair pressed flat and pulled back because she'd read in a magazine that it looked more professional, wearing a blouse that had been her mother's, staring straight into the camera with an expression that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite a frown, just a kind of careful neutrality, like a person who has learned that showing too much of anything makes you a target. She recognized that expression because she'd practiced it. Spent 30 minutes in the bathroom mirror every morning before school, getting it exactly right. Oh my God, is that Nia? Nia Brooks? She turned. The woman walking toward her had the specific energy of someone who had been watching the door. Tall, auburn highlights, wearing a red dress that announced itself ahead of her like a warning. Crystal Odom. Nia sorted through 15 years of distance and landed on a memory. Crystal in the hallway outside AP English, whispering something to a circle of girls who all looked at Nia at the same moment and then looked away, the way people look away from something embarrassing they didn't cause but don't intend to correct. Crystal, Nia kept her voice level. You look well. You're here. I honestly wasn't sure you'd come. Crystal said it with the particular warmth of someone who had not expected you and is performing delight to cover the fact. You look good, girl. You look comfortable. Comfortable. Nia filed that away. Is your husband with you? Crystal asked, glancing past her shoulder toward the lobby with an expression that was already calculating the answer. I saw on the RSVP that you marked +1, but then someone said you'd canceled it. He had a meeting run late. He'll be here. Oh, sure, of course. A small pause, perfectly calibrated. What does he do again? I don't think I ever saw you post anything about him. He's in business. Business, Crystal repeated, nodding the way people nod when they've decided something. "Well, come on in. Vanessa's already holding court in the back. You know how she is." A bright smile. "It'll be good to catch up." Nia followed her inside. The ballroom was louder than the lobby had suggested, the live band working through something upbeat while knots of former classmates clustered near the bar, near the photo walls, near the rows of tables where assigned seating had apparently been abandoned in favor of self-selected hierarchies that turned out to look almost identical to the lunch tables of 2009. The football players were with the football players. The girls who had run the student council occupied a long table near the center. The kids who had been too strange or too quiet or too poor or too heavy stood in the peripheral spaces near the walls, nursing drinks and performing ease with varying degrees of success. Nia got a glass of water from the bar and found a spot near a floral arrangement large enough to provide partial cover. She watched the room. This was something she'd gotten good at, watching rooms. Dominic had noticed it early in their relationship, told her she had the instincts of a strategist, that she processed information the way other people processed air, constantly and without thinking about it. She hadn't told him it was a survival skill she'd developed at 14 because her body had marked her as a target, and her brain had responded by becoming very, very good at tracking threat. She spotted Vanessa Caldwell 12 minutes after arriving. Vanessa had not changed in any way that mattered. The hair was more expensive, the body more aggressively maintained, the jewelry the kind that made statements in rooms. But the posture was the same, slightly forward, chin lifted, always angled toward whoever in the immediate vicinity was generating the most attention, like a satellite dish adjusted to receive the strongest signal. Vanessa had been the kind of beautiful that required an audience and the kind of cruel that required a witness, and she had spent 4 years of high school building systems to ensure she always had both. Nia had been, in those years, one of Vanessa's preferred materials. She was aware of exactly when Vanessa saw her. There was a pause in Vanessa's conversation, subtle enough that only someone watching for it would notice. Then a slow turn, a long look, and a smile that carried 15 years of unchanged opinion in it. Nia Brooks. Vanessa crossed the room like she owned the floor under it. "Baby, I almost didn't recognize you." "Vanessa, you haven't changed a bit," said with such specific emphasis that it couldn't be anything except the opposite of a compliment. "I mean that exactly the same." "Thank you." Vanessa blinked, recalibrating. Nia had spent enough time around men who negotiated in rooms where blinking first meant losing that she'd learned to absorb what was thrown at her without flinching, without redirecting it, without giving it anywhere to go. It was not a natural skill. It had cost her something to learn it. "Are you here alone?" Vanessa asked, looking around with performative concern. "My husband will be joining me." The silence that followed was exactly half a second too long. "Your husband?" "Yes." Vanessa smiled again. "Of course. And where is he?" "Finishing a meeting. He'll be here soon." Around them, without announcement, a small gravitational pull had begun. The way it always had with Vanessa, people orbiting toward the energy of whatever was happening without knowing exactly what it was yet, drawn by instinct or boredom or the particular cruelty that lives in groups of people who once shared a building and have never fully left it. "What kind of meeting runs this late on a Friday?" Vanessa asked, and her voice had acquired an edge of performance now, shaped for the people drifting into earshot. "Sounds made up, honestly." A small laugh. 1 or 2 people nearby responded to it automatically. "He's thorough," Nia said. Vanessa tilted her head. "What does he do? Your husband?" "Business. Business." She said it the way Crystal had said it, which was the way you repeat something when you've decided it's a lie and want the room to hear your decision. "What kind of business?" "The successful kind." A few people laughed. Vanessa's eyes sharpened, but the smile didn't waver. She was good at this. She'd always been good at this. "Nia, sweetheart, you can just say you came alone. Nobody's judging." "I didn't come alone." "Because there's nothing wrong with being single at our age. Some people are just better at it than others. Some people—" She paused, let her gaze travel the length of Nia's body with the specific deliberateness of someone pressing a bruise. Some people have different kinds of challenges when it comes to relationships. The circle was larger now. 8 people, maybe 10. Some of them were looking at Nia with the waiting expression of people who expected to see something break. Some of them were looking at Vanessa with the uneasy appreciation of people who know they should stop watching, but can't. Nia's chest was tight. She was aware of it in the way she was aware of the heels she'd worn despite knowing they'd hurt by the end of the night, a decision she'd made anyway because she'd wanted to feel tall. She was aware of the slight heat behind her eyes that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. She was aware that 15 years of building a life that no one in this ballroom had the clearance to understand was sitting in her stomach like something she'd swallowed wrong. She didn't let any of it reach her face. "Vanessa," she said quietly, "I'm not going to fight with you tonight." "Fight?" Vanessa laughed, and it was the laugh that Nia remembered from the east hallway, outside the gym locker room, at the edges of the parking lot after school. "Who's fighting? I'm just making conversation. I'm just saying that we all grew up, we all moved on, some of us built careers, some of us built families." Another look, this one lingering at Nia's hands, her ring, the size of the stone that she wore like something she'd forgotten was there. "And some of us are still figuring it out, that's all." "That's a beautiful ring," someone said suddenly. A woman Nia didn't immediately recognize, somewhere behind Vanessa's left shoulder. Vanessa's attention snapped to Nia's hand. The smile flickered, but just for a moment, before it reassembled itself. "Oh, that's gorgeous. Where'd you get that?" "My husband gave it to me." "Right, the husband. Who's in a meeting?" "Yes." "On a Friday night." "Important men have important obligations," Nia said. "He'll be here when he can." "Important men." Vanessa let the words sit in the air. Then she turned just slightly toward the circle that had formed around them, playing to it now, with the ease of someone who had been doing this her entire life. "Ladies, did you know Nia was married to an important man?" The laughter that followed was the kind that arrives before the punchline, because the audience already trusts the comedian. "What's his name, Nia? This important husband of yours?" A beat. Nia held it for a moment, let it breathe. "Dominic," she said. "Dominic." Vanessa nodded slowly, meaningfully. "And what does Dominic think about his wife coming to her high school reunion without him?" "He thinks I'm stronger than I look." Something crossed Vanessa's face. Not quite respect, not quite discomfort. Something else. Something that recognized the shape of a person who has been through fire and come out the other side without announcing it. But it was gone quickly, swallowed by the crowd and the noise and the particular momentum of a public performance that had already gathered too much weight to stop. "You know what? I think you should call him," Vanessa said. "Right now. Put him on speaker. Let us all say hello to the important Dominic." More laughter. Someone whistled softly. "Because honestly, Nia, and I'm saying this as someone who went to school with you, who knew you, nobody in this room believes you." She spread her hands in a gesture of theatrical bewilderment. "I mean, no offense, but look around. These people know you. They remember. And the idea that some powerful man would—" She gestured toward Nia's body with a small wave that cataloged everything it touched. "I mean, come on, sweetheart, who are we kidding?" The room was very quiet. Nia felt the eyes on her, not 2 or 3 or 8, but most of the ballroom now, drawn toward the current of this moment. The particular electric stillness of a public humiliation in progress. She felt the tight thing in her chest pull tighter, felt the familiar instruction her body had been running since she was 14 years old. Make yourself smaller, make it stop, disappear. She did not follow the instruction. She looked at Vanessa steadily, and when she spoke, her voice was low and completely even. "He'll be here." Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, and then every phone in the room buzzed. Not a few. All of them. A coordinated ripple of notifications passing through the ballroom like a wave, person by person, pocket by pocket. Nia watched people glance down, watched their expressions shift, watched something move through the crowd that she couldn't name yet, but that raised the hair on her arms. Outside the hotel's tall windows, something had changed. The street, which had been ordinarily busy, had gone very quiet. 3 large black SUVs sat at the curb, their engines running, their windows dark. A fourth was pulling in behind them. Vanessa had turned toward the window without realizing she'd done it, and that was when the ballroom doors opened. The bodyguards entered first. Not rushing, not looking at anyone in particular, just moving through the room like weather moves through a valley. Steady, inevitable, reshaping everything in its path without asking permission. Nia's hand tightened around her water glass. Across the circle of stunned former classmates, Vanessa had gone very still. And then the doors opened wider. The first bodyguard through the door was built like a man who had stopped explaining himself years ago. Wide across the shoulders, dark suit, earpiece catching the light from the chandelier above. He didn't scan the room the way a nervous person scans a room. Eyes jumping, head moving. He took it all in from the threshold, one long, slow sweep, the kind of look that catalogs exits and threats and neutral parties and files them in some internal system that never stops running. Then he stepped to the left. The second came through immediately after. Same build, different face, same economy of movement. He went right. A third. A fourth. They arranged themselves without speaking, without gesturing to each other, with the quiet precision of people who have done this in rooms far more dangerous than a hotel ballroom in Chicago on a Friday night, and the fact that they moved this way here, in a room full of former high school classmates holding cocktails and wearing name tags, said something about the man who was coming through those doors next. The ballroom had not gone fully silent. Not yet. There were still pockets of conversation near the bar, people who hadn't noticed, people whose backs were turned. But there was a pressure drop in the room, the kind you feel before something changes, and it moved outward from the doors in a slow wave until it reached the corners, and even the people who hadn't been watching turned to look. Vanessa Caldwell had not moved. She was standing exactly where she'd been standing when the doors opened. Her weight shifted slightly onto her back foot, her champagne glass at half-mast, and she was watching the entrance with the expression of a person who has been the most powerful thing in a room for 20 years and has just registered a frequency they don't recognize. Nia set her water glass down on the nearest table. Her hands were steady. That surprised her, because her chest was not steady, and her breathing was not steady. Short and shallow, coming through her nose, the kind of breathing that happens when your body is managing something your face has agreed not to show. She had known, in an abstract way, that Dominic might come. He had told her he would try. She had not, if she was honest, expected him to actually walk through those doors tonight, because the meeting he'd been in when she left the house had the quality of meetings that didn't end on anyone else's schedule. But here were the bodyguards, which meant here, shortly, was Dominic. She pressed her thumbnail into the inside of her palm. An old habit, something to anchor her in the present tense, in the specific coordinates of her own body, when things around her started moving faster than she could process. The circle that had formed around her during Vanessa's performance was still there. 8, maybe 10 people, most of them with their phones out now, because the phones had buzzed minutes ago, and several of them had looked down and looked back up with expressions that didn't connect to each other. Confusion, something close to alarm, the particular blankness of people receiving information that doesn't fit any context they currently possess. Marcus Webb, who had been the student body president and had laughed loudest at Vanessa's comment about powerful men, was standing with his mouth slightly open, his phone turned face down against his thigh, like he was trying to hide what he'd just read. Crystal had drifted back 2 full steps without seeming to notice she'd done it. Vanessa hadn't looked at her phone. Vanessa was still watching the door. "Who called security?" someone said near the bar. Not loudly, just a voice, uncertain, searching the room for an answer. Nobody responded. One of the bodyguards near the left side of the entrance raised 2 fingers briefly, a signal invisible to most of the room, and then the doors opened again. Not pushed by anyone visible, simply opened. And Dominic Vescari walked into the Grand Meridian Hotel ballroom on a Friday night in October as though he had built the building and was checking on it. He was not what most of them had expected. Nia knew this because she had learned to read the specific quality of surprise that crossed people's faces when they encountered her husband in person for the first time. The way their image of him, assembled from rumors and magazine covers, and the particular mythology that grows around powerful men in this city, collided with the reality of him and had to rapidly reassemble. He was not the largest man in the room. He He was not performing dominance the way some men perform it, loudly, with their chests and their chins. He was wearing a black suit that had clearly been made for his body by someone who understood bodies, a white shirt open at the collar because he'd been in that meeting for 6 hours and had pulled the tie loose somewhere around hour 4, and he moved through the space between the door and the center of the room with the particular economy of a man who has learned that stillness is more threatening than motion. His eyes found Nia in 4 seconds. She counted, after the fact, because she'd noticed. He came toward her directly. No detour, no acknowledgement of the room, no pause to establish himself against the backdrop of whatever this gathering was. The bodyguards adjusted around him without instruction, creating a corridor of space that the other guests stepped back from without being asked. He stopped in front of her. Up close, she could see the faint shadow under his jaw where he hadn't shaved since morning. The small tension at the corner of his left eye that only she knew meant he was tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix tonight. He was 41 years old, and he had spent most of those years in rooms where the wrong word meant consequences that didn't end with an apology, and it showed in him the way weather shows in old wood, not as damage exactly, but as something that had been shaped by pressure into something harder and more particular than it started. "I'm sorry I'm late," he said. His voice was low, even, aimed only at her. "The meeting ran longer than I expected." "I know," she said. "It's okay." "Is it?" He looked at her the way he always looked at her when he was asking something other than what he was asking. She nodded, and then, because she had been holding herself very carefully for the past 35 minutes, and some part of her had apparently decided that Dominic's presence was the signal it had been waiting for, she felt the pressure behind her eyes sharpen into something immediate and had to look at a point just past his shoulder for a moment until it receded. He saw it. He saw everything, always, which was a quality that had unsettled her about him in the early years of their relationship and now felt like the most solid ground she'd ever stood on. "Who," he said very quietly, "made you cry?" It wasn't a question. It was the specific vocal register of a man who has already decided something and is collecting the last piece of information he needs to act on it. "I'm not crying," Nia said. "You're close." "I'm fine, Dominic." He looked at her for another moment. Then, with the controlled deliberateness of a person who has made a decision to stay inside a particular lane for now, he put his arm around her shoulders and pressed his mouth to her forehead, and Nia felt the tight thing in her chest release approximately half of its tension because he was warm, and he was here, and he smelled like the specific combination of cold air and cedar that meant he had come straight from wherever the meeting was without stopping anywhere in between. Behind her, she heard Vanessa make a sound. It was small, involuntary, the sound a person makes when the story they've been telling runs into a wall. A sharp little intake of breath, swallowed almost immediately, but not quite fast enough. Dominic lifted his head. He looked past Nia's shoulder into the circle of former classmates, and whatever his face was doing in that moment, Nia felt the room change temperature around her because she heard the quality of silence shift from surprise to something else. Something with more weight in it, something that people who trusted their instincts were already stepping back from. "Introduce me," he said to Nia, quietly, pleasantly. "Dominic, it's okay." A slight pressure from his arm around her shoulders. "We're just meeting people." She turned, and he turned with her, and the circle of former classmates was still there. 8 people, slightly reconfigured, with several new additions who had drifted over from the perimeter of the room, drawn by the displacement of air that came with the arrival of the bodyguards, and hadn't quite made sense of what they were seeing yet. Vanessa had recovered. Nia had to give her that. Whatever the surprise had done to her face in the first 10 seconds, it had been sealed over now with something that looked from a distance like composure, and from close up looked like a person gripping a ledge with both hands. "Well," Vanessa said, and her voice was carrying again, shaped for the room. "Look at that. He actually showed up." Nobody laughed this time. Vanessa seemed to notice the silence and plowed forward into it. "Nia, you should have said he was coming right away. We've been keeping you all to ourselves." A wide smile, bright and effortful. "Hi, I'm Vanessa. I went to school with your wife." Dominic looked at her. Just looked. The kind of look that doesn't move, doesn't shift, doesn't give you anything to work with or push against. It lasted approximately 3 seconds, which is a very long time for a look. "Dominic," he said.
Just Dominic? Vanessa laughed. No last name? Most people already know it. Somewhere behind Vanessa, Marcus Webb made a sound that might have been a cough. Crystal had moved entirely to the outer edge of the group and appeared to be calculating the distance to the bar. Vanessa was not most people. Or, more accurately, Vanessa had spent 20 years being the most powerful thing in the room she was in, and that accumulation had built something in her that didn't recognize its own limits clearly. She held the smile. "Well, it's nice to meet you. We were just getting reacquainted with Nia, catching up. You know how it is. Old friends." The slight pause before friends was calibrated to be noticeable without being undeniable. "She was telling us all about you. Your important meeting." "Was she? We weren't sure you were real, honestly." Vanessa laughed again, and this time 2 or 3 people at the edges of the group laughed with her, reflexively, the way people laugh when they're nervous and someone else laughs first, and they don't want to be left standing outside the joke. "No offense, it's just, Nia was always very creative." The word landed and sat there. Nia felt Dominic's hand on her shoulder. Not gripping, not communicating anything aggressive, just there, present. "Creative," he repeated. "You know what I mean." Vanessa waved a hand. "In school. She had a big imagination. We always loved that about her." The we doing enormous work in that sentence, implying a warmth and a closeness that had never existed. "So when she said her husband was on his way, some of us," she gestured toward the group with inclusive generosity, "we just thought, maybe she'd embellished a little." "Embellished? It's not a criticism. It's just, what else did you think she'd embellished?" Dominic asked. The smile flickered. "I'm sorry? You said some of you thought she'd embellished. What else? Just the husband, or was there more?" The group was very quiet now, not the polite quiet of people waiting their turn to speak, the specific quiet of people who have understood that they are in the presence of something that does not move the way they expected it to move and are processing the recalibration. Vanessa set her champagne glass down on a nearby table, a deliberate gesture, buying 3 seconds. "Look, I don't want to make this into a thing." "It's already a thing," Dominic said, still quiet, still completely level. "My wife has been in this room for... how long?" He looked at Nia. "About 40 minutes, Nia said. 40 minutes. He looked back at Vanessa. "And in 40 minutes, what happened?" "Nothing happened. We were just... she's been crying." He said it plainly, without drama, the way you state a fact that has been established. "My wife does not cry. I have known this woman for 7 years, and I can count on one hand the number of times I have seen tears in her eyes, and those were times that warranted it. So something happened." Vanessa's composure was still intact, but it was working harder now, visibly, the way a structure works harder in wind. "She's not crying. Look at her, she's fine. Tell me what was said." Not to Vanessa. He'd moved his gaze to the group, to the broader ring of people who had gathered, and he was looking at them with the patient, unrushed expression of a man who has learned that people fill silence if you give them enough of it. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then a woman named Priya, who Nia remembered as someone who had never been cruel but had also never intervened, said quietly, "Vanessa told her that no successful man would choose..." She stopped, glanced at Vanessa, looked back at Dominic. "She said some things about Nia's appearance, and about why she'd probably made you up." The silence after that was different, heavier. Vanessa turned on Priya with an expression that had shed most of its social coating. "Seriously? You're going to..." "It's..." "What things?" Dominic said, specifically. "Dominic," Nia put her hand on his arm, "it doesn't matter. It matters to me. I know, but I handled it." He looked at her, and in the look was something she recognized. The particular tension of a man who runs on the principle that things done to people he loves do not go unaddressed, colliding with the knowledge that the person he loves is asking him to exercise restraint. It was a negotiation they had conducted before, in different rooms, under different circumstances, and it never got simpler.
She called her fat, Marcus Webb said suddenly. Everyone looked at him. He seemed slightly surprised by his own voice, as though it had acted without full authorization. He'd put his phone in his pocket, and his face had the look of someone who has been calculating something for several minutes and has arrived at a conclusion he doesn't entirely like. Vanessa called her fat and said, "She said that a man like you would never actually want someone who looks like Nia, that you were made up, that the ring was probably fake." A pause. She said it in front of about 20 people. The room had expanded around them. More people had gathered, drawn by the bodyguards and by the particular quality of this silence, and they were standing at a respectful distance, but they were listening. 40 people. 50. Most of the ballroom. Vanessa turned back toward Dominic with the last of her composure assembled like armor. "That is a completely unfair characterization of a private conversation. I was teasing. It was banter. Nia knows I didn't mean anything by it." "Do you?" Dominic asked Nia. Nia looked at Vanessa. Looked at her the way she'd been looking at her for 40 minutes, the steady, unflinching gaze that had been the only armor she'd had before Dominic walked through the door. "No," she said. "I don't." Vanessa's face moved through several expressions quickly, landing on something that was trying to be righteous indignation and arriving closer to desperation. "This is ridiculous. This is a high school reunion. We're adults. You can't come in here and interrogate people like this as some kind of—" She stopped. Dominic waited. "Some kind of what?" he said. Vanessa closed her mouth, because she had recognized somewhere in the middle of that sentence the specific danger of finishing it, of saying the word that the sentence was building toward, of naming, out loud, in a room full of witnesses, what she thought she knew about the man standing in front of her. She'd looked it up, Nia realized. In the minutes between Dominic's arrival and now, Vanessa had looked up the name, had found the magazine profiles and the business columns and the other things, the things that lived in the negative space around his name, and she had arrived at the same place everyone arrived when they did that research, the place that was simultaneously more and less dangerous than they'd expected. She stood there with the sentence hanging open and said nothing. Dominic let the silence go on for a full 10 seconds. Then he looked at Nia, and his expression had changed. Not softened exactly, but shifted toward something more personal, less cold. "Come sit with me," he said. "Dominic, what are you going to—" "Sit with me first," he said. "Then we'll talk." He guided her toward a table near the center of the room, and his security team adjusted around them with that same wordless precision, and the crowd parted, and Nia felt 50 pairs of eyes on her back as she walked, and she kept her spine straight and her chin level, and she thought about all the times she had walked through a room that didn't want her in it, and how none of those times had ever felt quite like this one. Because this time she was not walking out. She was walking toward the center, with a man whose hand was warm at the small of her back and whose presence was rearranging the room's understanding of who she was. They sat. A waiter materialized and was dismissed with a small gesture. Two of the bodyguards positioned themselves nearby, close enough to matter, far enough to allow the illusion of a private conversation. "Tell me everything," Dominic said. "From the beginning." Nia looked at the table, at the white linen, the small floral centerpiece, the slightly melted candle. She looked at Dominic's hands on the table, the scar across the knuckle of his right index finger that she knew the story of and that most people in this room would speculate about. She thought about the east stairwell. She thought about the 30 minutes in the bathroom mirror every morning. She thought about 14 and 18 and 23 and every age in between when she had carried other people's cruelty around inside her like it was something she owed them. "She said that a fat black woman doesn't get to have a man like you," Nia said. Flat, factual, a report. She said it loud enough that half the room heard it, and they laughed. Dominic was very still. "She said my ring was probably from a department store. She said I was making you up because I was too ashamed to come alone. She asked me to call you and put it on speaker so everyone could hear what nobody picked up." Nia paused. "And then about 30 people stood there and laughed, and not one person in this room said anything, and I stood there and I was—" She stopped, drew a breath. "I was 14 years old again. That's what I was." The candle between them flickered in a draft from the air conditioning. Dominic's jaw had set in the way she knew. Not visibly angry in the way most people expressed anger. Something quieter, more structural, the way ice forms. Incrementally, from the outside in, until what was fluid is no longer fluid at all. "How many people?" he said. "What?" Laughed. "You said 30. Who were they?" "Dominic." "Nia." His eyes came up to hers. "How many people stood in this room and laughed at my wife?" And there it was, she thought. Not my wife was humiliated or people were cruel to you, but the possessive, the specific gravity of it, the way he said my wife as though those two words were the load-bearing element of everything he had built, and any force applied against them was a structural problem that required immediate resolution, not as ego, not as ownership, but as the most fundamental premise of his life, that this woman was under his protection, and anything that got through that protection was a failure he would spend whatever was necessary to correct. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Let me handle the apologies," she said, "and you handle the rest." His eyes stayed on hers for a moment. Then something shifted in his face. Not concession exactly, but recognition. Of who she was. Of the specific competence she brought to things he would have handled very differently. "All right," he said. He pushed back his chair. He stood up, and the two bodyguards nearest them moved in, and the room, which had been quietly attempting to return to normal, went still again because Dominic Vescari was standing in the middle of the Grand Meridian Ballroom, and his face had the expression of a man who has something to say and has no particular investment in whether anyone wants to hear it. "I need everyone's attention," he said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room's acoustics did the work, and the particular quality of the silence that had been following him since he walked through the door did the rest. "All of it, right now." Vanessa, across the room, had not moved from where Nia had last seen her. She was standing with two other women, and all three of them had the look of people who have just understood something and are experiencing the understanding as a physical sensation. The band had stopped playing. Nobody had told them to stop. They had simply read the room and reached the same conclusion independently. 50, 60 people turned toward Dominic Vescari, and the last ordinary moment of the Lincoln Park Preparatory 15-year reunion. The last ordinary moment of the Lincoln Park Preparatory 15-year reunion died quietly, without ceremony, the way most ordinary things die. Not with an explosion, but with a door closing, a sound stopping, a room full of people reaching the simultaneous understanding that whatever happened next was not going to resemble anything that had come before it. Dominic stood at the center of the ballroom with 60 people looking at him and said nothing for 5 full seconds. Not because he was searching for words. He had the words. He'd had them since Nia told him about the east stairwell. Not tonight, not at this table with the melting candle between them, but 3 years ago on a Tuesday night in their kitchen when she'd told him for the first time where she'd eaten lunch in high school, and he'd looked at her across the counter and understood something about the specific architecture of her dignity that he hadn't fully understood before, how it had been built not from ease, but from surviving conditions that should have broken her, and how the fact that it hadn't was the most formidable thing about her, and also the thing most people in this room had just finished mistaking for weakness. He waited the 5 seconds because he wanted the room to feel the weight of his attention before he decided where to put it. Then he spoke. "My wife," he said, "has been in this room for 45 minutes. His voice carried without effort, clear, even, unhurried. The voice of a man who has learned that volume is for people who aren't certain they'll be listened to. In those 45 minutes, several people in this room told her that a woman who looks like her doesn't deserve a man like me. A pause, brief and deliberate. I want to talk about that. The room did not move. 60 people in formal wear stood in the particular stillness of an audience that has realized it is no longer an audience but a participant, and the distinction has arrived too late for anyone to leave gracefully. Vanessa was standing 12 feet away at Dominic's 11 o'clock. Nia, from her seat, watched Vanessa's face with the attention she'd been giving it all evening, cataloging every micro-expression, every recalibration, the small constant work of a person managing a situation that has exceeded their management capacity. Vanessa's hands were at her sides now. The champagne glass had been set down somewhere and not retrieved, and her hands without it looked strangely exposed, like tools that had lost their purpose. "I'm not going to pretend," Dominic continued, "that I don't understand what was said or what it meant. I understand it completely." He looked briefly and directly at Vanessa. "And I want the people who said it to understand something in return." Vanessa held the look. Her chin was up. She had committed to a register of composure and was going to hold it the way you hold a losing poker hand. Not because you believe it, but because putting it down means the game is over. "This woman," Dominic said, and the slight shift in his voice towards something less formal, more personal, moved through the room like a change in barometric pressure, "was in this building every day for 4 years while some of you were busy deciding what she was worth. While some of you were running those calculations based on what she weighed and what she wore and who walked beside her in the hallway." He stopped. Let it settle. She was also, in those same 4 years, tutoring kids in the neighborhood after school for free. She was sitting with her mother through a serious illness and not telling anyone because she didn't want sympathy. She was reading everything she could get her hands on because she had decided at 14 years old that the only thing nobody could take from her was what she knew. He looked at Nia then, and the look was not performance. It was the specific look of a man saying something true in public that he has previously only said in private. She was becoming the person who, 8 years later, would walk into the worst period of my life and not walk back out. Nia sat very still. She had not known he was going to say any of this. That was the thing about Dominic. He moved through the world with such consistent deliberateness that people sometimes mistook it for coldness, for the absence of interior life, and then moments like this one arrived and recalibrated everything. She felt the pressure behind her eyes again and pressed her thumbnail into her palm again and held very steady. "I'm not here," Dominic said, returning his gaze to the room, "to threaten anyone." A slight pause that functioned as the opposite of reassurance. "I'm here because my wife wanted to come back to a place that was hard for her, because she is the kind of person who walks toward hard things, and I am going to stand next to her while she does it." Another pause. "And I am going to remember everything I've seen in this room tonight. That is all." He pulled out the chair across from Nia and sat down. The room exhaled. Not all at once. Unevenly, person by person, the release of held breath arriving in waves across the ballroom as people processed the fact that the speech was over, that it had not ended with anything overt, that what had just happened was simultaneously less and more than they'd expected, and that the more was going to take a while to fully arrive. The band did not resume playing. Near the bar, a man Nia distantly recognized as Devin Marsh, offensive tackle, 2 years ahead of her, had once knocked her lunch tray out of her hands in the hallway and laughed and kept walking, was staring at the floor with the specific expression of a person taking inventory of themselves and not enjoying the results. Crystal had made it to the bar. She was holding a drink she wasn't sipping, her back partially to the room, one shoulder raised slightly as though against a wind only she could feel. And Vanessa. Vanessa was still standing in the same spot, and something had happened to her face in the 30 seconds since Dominic sat down. The composure was still there, technically. The chin still up, the spine still straight, the expression still arranged in the general vicinity of dignity. But the thing underneath it, the engine that had been running all evening, the specific fuel of her confidence in this room, had changed. It was running rough now. It was making sounds. She crossed the floor toward their table. Nia saw her coming and felt something in her stomach tighten, not with fear exactly. She was past the fear. It had burned through its fuel, but with a kind of animal alertness, the heightened awareness of something that isn't finished yet. Dominic saw her coming too. His eyes tracked her without his head moving. Vanessa stopped 2 feet from the table. "That was quite a speech," she said. Her voice was level. Impressively level, Nia thought, given everything. "Very moving." Dominic said nothing. "I want to apologize," Vanessa said, and turned toward Nia. "Nia, what I said tonight was unkind. I'm sorry." The table was quiet for a moment. "Vanessa," Nia said, "I mean it. It was out of line. I got caught up in—" She stopped, recalibrated. "I was cruel. And I'm sorry." It was almost good. It had the shape of contrition,
The right words in roughly the right order, delivered with enough surface-level sincerity that in a different context, with a different history between them, it might have landed as genuine. Nia looked at her, really looked at her, the way she'd been looking at things all evening, with the eyes that had been trained by years of watching rooms for information. And what she saw was not remorse. What she saw was a woman doing rapid calculations, assessing whether an apology issued in front of Dominic Vescari while his security team stood 10 feet away would function as sufficient protective cover for whatever she was afraid came next. The apology was real in the sense that Vanessa was genuinely sorry. She was sorry that Dominic had walked through that door. She was sorry the room had witnessed the last 45 minutes. She was sorry for the outcomes, not for the actions. "Thank you," Nia said. Vanessa nodded, started to turn. "Can I ask you something?" Nia said. Vanessa turned back. "Why did you do it?" Nia asked. Not aggressively, not performing anything, just a question, flat and genuine from someone who actually wanted to know the answer. "Not tonight specifically, in school." "Why me?" Something crossed Vanessa's face, complicated and quick. "Nia, I've wanted to ask for 15 years. You're here, I'm here, we're both adults. So tell me." She held Vanessa's eyes. "What did I do?" The ballroom had settled into a watching quiet. Not obvious, not collective, but present. People at nearby tables angled slightly toward this conversation, heads tilted. The peripheral attention of people who know they're witnessing something that isn't for them but can't quite look away. Vanessa's jaw worked. Several things moved across her face and were suppressed. Then, in a voice that had dropped to something much less performed than anything she'd said all evening, "You didn't care what we thought." Nia blinked. "That's it? You'd walk through the hallway and look straight ahead, like we weren't even there." Vanessa shook her head slightly. The motion was small and involuntary, reaching toward something old. "Like our opinion of you. Didn't even register, and I didn't—" She stopped. "You didn't like that," Nia said. "No?" A beat. "I didn't." The simplicity of it sat between them like something finally put down after a long carry. And that was when the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened again. Not the main entrance, a side door, the kind used by staff and catering, which was why nobody was watching it, why no bodyguard was positioned near it, why the man who came through it got 6 full steps into the room before anyone registered that he was there and that he did not belong, and that his presence was the specific kind of wrong that precedes something catastrophic. He was young, mid-20s, dark jacket, moving fast with the head-down urgency of someone navigating a tight timeline. He wasn't looking at the guests. He was looking at Dominic. The nearest bodyguard saw him at the same moment Nia did. She saw the guard's hand move, a rapid, practiced motion toward the inside of his jacket, and she grabbed Dominic's arm without thinking, without knowing exactly what she was responding to, only that something in the room had changed at a frequency below conscious processing, and her body had answered it before her mind could. "Dom," she said. Dominic was already turning. The young man stopped. He had stopped because the bodyguard had moved between them, and because 2 other members of the security team had repositioned with the smooth speed of people who train for exactly this interval, the seconds between a threat being identified and a threat being neutralized. The young man raised both hands, palms out, the international gesture of "I am not what you think," but his face was pale and his breathing was wrong, too fast, too shallow, the breathing of someone carrying bad news at a sprint. "Mr. Vescari," his voice cracked slightly on the name. "I'm sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt. I work for Mr. Caruso. He sent me." The temperature in Dominic's expression dropped approximately 10 degrees. "Rafael Caruso." "Yes, sir." He said. The young man glanced at the nearest bodyguard, at the hand still resting inside his jacket, and swallowed. "He said to tell you the meeting tonight wasn't a negotiation. He said you'd understand what that means." The room around them had gone very still again, but this was a different still than before. This was the stillness of people who have understood that they are present for something that has nothing to do with high school reunions, that the stakes operating in this room have just shifted into a register they don't have vocabulary for.
and that the appropriate response is to become very small and very quiet. Nia watched Dominic's face. She knew this face. She had studied it across 7 years of breakfasts and negotiations, and the long silent drives that followed evenings like the ones she never asked about. She knew the face he made when he was managing frustration and the face he made when he was genuinely afraid, which was a face almost nobody else had ever seen. She knew the face he made when someone had done something that could not be undone. This was the last one. "Where is he?" Dominic said. "He's left the city, sir. That's the other thing I was supposed to tell you." The young man's hands were still raised. He looked like he very much wanted to be somewhere else. He moved up the timeline, the Harborview transfer, the accounts. "It's done. He closed it tonight, during your meeting. That's why the meeting ran long. They were keeping you—" He stopped. His voice had gone thin. "They were keeping you occupied." Dominic was very still. Nia felt his stillness the way you feel a structural change in a building, not through any single sense, but through all of them simultaneously, a full-body awareness that something load-bearing has just shifted. "He moved the accounts," Dominic said. "Yes, sir. While I was in the meeting." "Yes, sir. I'm sorry. I only just found out. I came straight here." Nia looked at Dominic and saw something she had seen only twice in 7 years, and hoped both times she would not have to see again. The look of a man who has been outmaneuvered, who has planned carefully, moved carefully, held his position with every tool available to him, and discovered that someone had been moving behind him in the dark and is now several steps ahead in a game where being several steps behind is not a recoverable position. He turned away from the young man. Not dramatically. Just a turn, a quarter rotation, his gaze going to the middle distance somewhere above the white linen tablecloths and the frozen guests and the unlit candles. His hands on the table were flat, palms down, very still. She could see a muscle working in his jaw. "Dominic," she said quietly. He didn't respond immediately. She watched him do what she'd watched him do before. Take something enormous and catastrophic and compress it, rapidly, ruthlessly, into a package small enough to operate around. It was a skill she had admired and worried about in equal measure from the first moment she understood he possessed it, because the things you compress don't disappear, they only wait, and the waiting changes their shape. "How much?" he said. Not to her. To the young man, who was still standing with his hands raised, still wearing the expression of someone who has delivered a grenade and is waiting to see which way it goes. "All of it, sir. The Harborview accounts. The offshore transfers that were routed through the—" The young man glanced again at the room, at the guests who were almost certainly listening, and lowered his voice. "Through the secondary structure. It's been moved into accounts we can't access." "How long ago?" "About 2 hours." 2 hours. Nia did the calculation without intending to. 2 hours ago, she had been in this hotel for approximately 15 minutes. Dominic had been in a meeting that had been designed, apparently, to occupy him, to hold his attention in one room while something moved behind him in another, while she stood in a circle of former classmates and held herself together under a barrage of cruelty that she had mistaken for the worst thing happening tonight. It had not been the worst thing happening tonight. "Who else knows?" Dominic said. "Just Mr. Caruso's people as far as I know, and you, and—" The young man stopped. His hands were still raised. He'd been holding them raised for 2 full minutes, and they had started to drift downward from fatigue. "And?" Dominic said. The young man's face did something complicated. "And my uncle asked me to give you a message along with the rest of it. He said to tell you that the woman who stood next to you in the dark years is the reason he moved now. He said you left yourself exposed. He said you made yourself soft." A long beat. "Those are his words, Mr. Vescari, not mine." The table was silent. Nia felt the sentence arrive in the room like a physical impact, felt it move through Dominic the way she'd felt that quarter rotation a moment ago. Not with a visible reaction, not with any external indication that it had landed, but with an absence, a stillness so complete it was its own kind of loud. He had been told, by an enemy who had just stolen everything he had spent years building through one of his most trusted relationships, that the vulnerability that made the theft possible was her. Not in those words, but in those words. "Get out," Dominic said. The young man lowered his hands and left the way he'd come, through the side door quickly, and then the door swung shut behind him, and the ballroom was quiet in a way that had no comparison to anything that had come before in this evening. Not the quiet of surprise or the quiet of attention, but the quiet of people who have understood that they are witnesses to something private and devastating and enormous, and have the specific social helplessness of not knowing how to leave without making it worse. Nia sat across from Dominic and looked at his face. He was looking at the table, at his hands, at the space between his hands, which was small and controlled and told her nothing about what was moving underneath it, except that it was moving fast and it was very large. "Dominic," she said. He raised his eyes, and what she saw in them was something she had no name for and had never seen before in 7 years of this man's face. Not fear, not anger, not the cold, compressed competence that was his default setting in crisis. Something under all of those things. Something older and more fundamental. The look of a person who has done the arithmetic and arrived at a number they cannot argue with. And the number is that they have lost something they cannot get back. And the reason they lost it is sitting across the table from them in a black dress that was the wrong choice for October. Not because he blamed her. She knew, in some precise interior way that she trusted completely, that he did not. But because Caruso's message had planted something, a seed of a thought, and the thought was going to grow in the dark whether Dominic intended it to or not. Whether he was the kind of man who would ever say it aloud or not, because thoughts don't require permission and damage doesn't wait to be acknowledged before it begins. She made herself hold his gaze, made herself stay in the chair and in the room and in the specific present tense of this moment, because every instinct she had was telling her to do something, to fix something, to find the exact right thing to say that would put this back on solid ground. She didn't have it. For the first time in 7 years, she did not know what the exact right thing was. "We need to go," Dominic said. His voice had changed, not in volume, not in tone, in temperature. The warmth that had been there when he pressed his mouth to her forehead and called her his queen had been replaced by something functional and sealed. "Now." He stood. The security team moved. Around the room, 60 people who had come to a high school reunion and had experienced instead something they would be processing for the rest of their lives, began the collective exhale of witnesses returning to themselves after a long absence. Nia stood. She picked up her small black purse. She straightened her dress. The wrong dress. The thin one that had let the October cold through from the first second outside the cab. Dominic walked ahead of her toward the main doors, and she followed, and the room parted around them, and she watched the back of his head and the set of his shoulders, and understood that in the space of 11 minutes, the ground beneath them had changed in a way that was going to require everything she had to navigate. Not tomorrow, not next week, but starting in approximately the time it would take them to reach the car. They were 10 feet from the main doors when Vanessa Caldwell spoke. "Nia." Nia stopped. Dominic did not, immediately, but he slowed, and she felt rather than saw the moment he registered that she had stopped and chose not to override it. She turned. Vanessa was standing where she'd been standing for the last several minutes, with the same 2 women beside her, and her face had gone through enough changes tonight that what was on it now was something Nia genuinely hadn't expected. Not hostility, not performance, not the last-ditch grasping of a woman trying to reclaim status. Something quieter. Something that might, in a different light, be called human. "I'm sorry," Vanessa said. Not loudly, not for the room. Just across the distance between them, direct and without framing. For tonight, and for before, for all of it. Nia looked at her. The woman who had known, 15 years ago, exactly which specific angle to press to make a 14-year-old girl feel like the worst version of herself. Who had looked at Nia today and chosen to do it again, in public, in front of 50 witnesses, because some patterns don't break without something large enough to break them. Something large enough had arrived tonight. Nia opened her mouth to respond, and then Dominic's hand was at the small of her back, not pushing, not redirecting, just present, warm through the thin fabric of the dress, reminding her that the car was running and the night had only just begun to show what it intended to cost them. The car was a black Suburban, idling at the curb with its hazards off and its engine running at that specific low frequency that expensive vehicles achieve when they have been built to absorb the road rather than report it. Nia slid in first, across the rear seat, and Dominic followed without a word, and the door closed behind him with the sealed compression of something airtight, and the vehicle moved before either of them had fully settled, merging into Michigan Avenue traffic with the unhurried efficiency of a driver who has navigated worse situations than a Friday night hotel pickup. The partition between the front and rear seats was up. They were alone, for the first time since Dominic had walked through the ballroom doors, and the privacy of it arrived with a weight that Nia hadn't anticipated, because the ballroom, for all its cruelty and its noise, had at least provided the structure of an external situation to manage. And now there was no external situation, only the two of them and the dark interior of a moving car and the thing that the young man's message had put between them. Dominic was looking out the window. Chicago moved past the glass in amber and white, the October night pressing itself against the city in the particular way it did in this part of the year, cold without commitment, not winter yet, but finished with any pretense of warmth. The streets were busy, the way Chicago streets are always busy on Fridays, pedestrians and taxis, and the occasional blue pulse of a transit bus, all of it ordinary and continuous, and completely indifferent to the arithmetic of catastrophe playing out in the rear seat of a Suburban moving north on Michigan. Nia watched the side of Dominic's face, the jaw muscle, the slight compression at the corner of his eye, the way his left hand rested on his knee, still and flat, which was his neutral state hand position when he was doing rapid interior calculation and didn't want the exterior to broadcast it. "Talk to me," she said. "Not yet." "Dominic." "Nia." A single syllable, low and final, not angry, just sealed. She pressed her lips together and looked at her own hands in her lap. The ring. The stone that Vanessa had called fake, which was not a diamond at all but a sapphire. A specific deep blue that she had chosen herself when Dominic had laid 6 options on the kitchen counter and told her to pick the one she actually wanted rather than the one she thought she was supposed to want. She had chosen the sapphire in approximately 4 seconds because she had learned, by then, that her instincts were more reliable than her second guessing. She applied that principle now, with difficulty, to the instruction to wait. The car turned east toward the lake, which was not the direction of their house. She noticed it and said nothing. Dominic had redirected without explanation, which meant the driver already had a destination, and the destination was operational rather than domestic. And she was in the car, and the car was moving, and she was going where it went. They drove for 11 minutes. The city thinned around them as they moved east and then south along the lake, the residential towers giving way to something more industrial in its bones, warehouses, and parking infrastructure, and the specific Chicago landscape that exists in the margins between neighborhoods that have names and blocks that don't. The Suburban pulled into an underground parking structure attached to a building that Nia recognized after a moment as one of the properties she had seen on documents but never visited. A legitimate business on its surface, a structure that served other purposes underneath, the kind of architecture that Dominic's world required, and that she had learned the shape of without ever requiring its interior. The car stopped. The driver's door opened and closed. No one opened theirs. Dominic still hadn't looked at her. "The money," she said. "Yes." "Caruso moved it. All of it, out of structures that took me 6 years to build." His voice was even and completely flat, the tone of someone describing weather or traffic conditions, which meant he was somewhere in a temperature range that most people never saw him reach. The Harborview accounts were the anchor point. Everything else routed through them. If those are gone, how gone? He turned from the window for the first time since the hotel, looked at her in the low amber light of the parking structure, the particular look he gave things he was measuring. Gone like they were never there. Raphael has been building toward this for 8 months, maybe longer. The meeting tonight was theater, 30 people in a room arguing over a deal that was never real, while his people moved through the back of the system and took everything that wasn't physically locked. A pause. He knew exactly where to go because he helped build it. He sat at my table for 12 years. The last sentence arrived quietly and sat there, and Nia felt its specific weight. Not just the financial catastrophe it described, But the personal one, the violation, 12 years of proximity and trust converted into the precise coordinates of a betrayal that had been planned long enough to be patient. "What does this mean?" she said. Not softly, not asking for comfort, asking for the specific operational answer. "It means we're exposed. The people who work with us, the people who depend on the structure being stable, they're going to hear about this. Some of them already have." He looked at his hands. When the structure looks unstable, people make decisions. Some of those decisions create additional problems. How fast? Hours. Maybe less. Nia absorbed this. The tight thing was back in her chest, different now, less to do with 15 years of hallway wounds and more to do with the present tense of this car and this parking structure and the look on her husband's face. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to go inside. There are people waiting. We're going to work out what's recoverable and how." He paused. "It may take all night. It may take longer than that." "I'm coming in." "No." "Dominic." "No." Firm, not negotiable. "Not tonight. Tonight is—" He stopped. She watched him choose the word with the care of a man who has decided not to lie, but also not to say the full thing. "Tonight is not safe for you to be in the room." And yesterday was. Yesterday the room was different. His eyes came up to hers. "Nia, please." She wanted to push back. The instinct was immediate and physical. She wanted to push her door open and follow him into whatever room was waiting in that building, because the alternative was sitting in a car in a parking structure with the particular helplessness of a person who has been excluded from the crisis that concerns her most. But she also had 7 years of knowing when the word please in Dominic's mouth meant something other than preference, when it meant he was asking her to trust him in a way that would cost her something and cost him more. She stayed in the seat. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he leaned across the distance between them and pressed his mouth to her temple, firm and brief, and she felt the warmth of it and held on to it with the part of her that was still standing in the Grand Meridian Ballroom being asked to be small. Then he was out of the car, and the door sealed behind him, and she was alone. The driver remained in front, motionless behind the partition. Somewhere in the building above, Dominic was walking into a room full of consequences. Somewhere across the city, Rafael Caruso was already gone, or pretending to be, or was somewhere close enough to observe what his actions had set in motion. And Nia was in the back of a car in an underground parking structure in her wrong dress, with an October chill that the vehicle's heating system was fighting back but hadn't fully defeated. She sat with it for approximately 4 minutes. Then she took out her phone and began to work. Not because she had a plan. She was not in this moment operating from strategy. She was operating from the specific, fierce refusal to be passive in a situation that was burning, from the instinct that had been with her since 14 years old. Not a fight instinct exactly, but a survive instinct. An absolute constitutional rejection of the position of person who sits still while things are decided. She opened her contacts. Not Dominic's inner circle. Those lines would be occupied. The people who could act on the financial side of this were already in motion or unavailable. She went to a different category. A name she hadn't dialed in 8 months but had kept at the top of a particular list because Dominic had told her once, when they were discussing contingencies, that if something happened and the usual channels were closed, this person was the channel that stayed open. Elaine Marsh. Attorney. Not the kind who appeared in courtrooms. The phone rang 3 times. "It's late," Elaine said by way of greeting. "I know, it's Nia Vescari." A brief pause, recalibrating. "What happened?" "Caruso moved the Harbor View accounts tonight. Full transfer. Dominic is in the building on Lakeshore now with his people, but I think—" She stopped, organized the thought. "I think there are accounts that aren't in that room's awareness. There's a secondary structure that was set up before I was in the picture. I only know about it because I found documentation 3 years ago, and Dominic explained it to me when I asked." She paused. "He didn't think it was relevant. I think it might be." Silence on the line, the sound of someone moving in a room, something being set down. "You're talking about the Alara Group filings?" "Yes." "Nia, those were dissolved in—" "They were restructured, not dissolved. There's a difference, and the paperwork supports it if you look at the 2021 amendments to the original charter. She said it flatly, from memory, because she had read it 3 years ago and filed it in the part of her mind that kept things she'd been told she didn't need, and had kept anyway. If those are still intact and Caruso doesn't know about them, if he only moved what he had access to, then there's something left. Another silence. Longer this time. Where did you get the 2021 amendment information? I read it. Does Dominic know you read it? He knows I read everything. A pause. Can you get into the filing system tonight? It's after 10 on a Friday. I know what time it is. A long breath on the line. Then, give me 40 minutes. The line went quiet, and Nia lowered the phone and looked at the concrete ceiling of the parking structure above the vehicle and breathed. Her heartbeat was doing something fast and slightly irregular, the physical response of a body that has been running on adrenaline since approximately 8:15 p.m. and is starting to report the accumulated costs. Her feet hurt. The heels had done exactly what she'd expected heels to do. The thin dress was not warm enough. She was thirsty in a way she hadn't registered until this moment, the specific dehydration of a person who has been talking and performing composure and managing their own emotional temperature for 4 hours without drinking anything except half a glass of water. She found a water bottle in the seat pocket, opened it, drank half of it in one go, and sat with the slight clearing of her head that followed. 38 minutes passed. The parking structure was quiet around the car. Distant sounds of the building, elevator machinery, the far acoustic echo of something structural. Once, the approach and retreat of another vehicle that came down the ramp, turned and left without stopping, its taillights a brief red smear across the concrete. Nia did not look at her phone. She sat with her own mind in the same way she had sat in the east stairwell at 14, not absent from herself, not dissociating, just occupying the space she was in with full attention and without catastrophizing, which was a skill that had cost her considerably to build, and that she used now with the specific gratitude of a person who understands what a thing cost. When her phone rang, she picked up before the second tone. The Alara Group restructuring is on file, Elaine said. The 2021 amendments created a subsidiary structure that wasn't part of the original Harborview routing. Caruso's transfers moved everything above that layer. The subsidiary is untouched. A pause waited with the specific gravity of a lawyer handling information that could reshape a situation. There are assets in that structure. Significant. Significant enough to matter. Yes. Nia closed her eyes for precisely 2 seconds. Send me what you can access. Everything. I'll take it to him. Nia, send it. He's in a meeting with Bagi. I know who he's in a meeting with. She was already reaching for the door handle. He needs this information more than he needs me to stay in the car. She didn't wait for Elaine's response. She opened the door and stepped out onto the concrete, and her heels rang against the floor of the parking structure in the specific way that sound rings in enclosed spaces, sharp, echoing, purposeful. And the driver's door opened immediately, the driver appearing around the hood of the vehicle with the expression of a man whose direct instruction just became complicated. Mrs. Vescari. Which floor? Nia said. Ma'am, Mr. Vescari asked that you... I'm not asking you to choose between me and my husband, Nia said. Her voice was level and completely without performance. I have information he needs right now. Which floor? The driver looked at her. He was a large, careful man, experienced in situations that required rapid calibration, and he calibrated this one in approximately 3 seconds and arrived at the correct conclusion, which was that the woman in front of him was going to find the floor with or without his help, and the only variable was whether he created an additional delay. Fourth, he said, east corridor, you'll need... She was already moving toward the elevator. The building inside was spare and industrial and lit with the specific overhead fluorescence of spaces not intended for comfort. 2 men were stationed at the elevator bank. Security, not the same team from the hotel, but carrying the same quality of attention. They saw her coming, and one of them reached for his radio. Tell them Nia Vescari is on her way up, she said without slowing. Tell them she has information about the Alara Group, and they have approximately 30 seconds to decide if they want it before she calls Elaine Marsh back and has it filed through a different channel. She stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. The 4th floor was a different world from the parking structure. Carpeted. Industrial gray, the carpet of an office rather than a home. A corridor running east, fluorescent above, 3 doors off it, all closed. Light visible under the second and third. The sound of voices from behind the third door, multiple, overlapping, with the particular cadence of men arguing in the contained way of men who can't afford to lose composure but are very close to losing it. She walked to the third door and opened it without knocking. The room went silent in the specific way of a room where silence is not the default. 8 men around a long table. She recognized 4 of them from the peripheral edges of Dominic's world. People she had been introduced to at events, whose names she knew and whose purposes she understood in general terms. 3 she didn't recognize. And Dominic, at the head of the table, who turned when the door opened with the expression of a man whose exact expectation has just been both violated and confirmed simultaneously. Nia. A single word, carrying approximately 11 separate meanings. The Elara Group subsidiary, she said. She crossed to the table. Her heels were loud on the flooring where the carpet ended, and she let them be loud, and she set her phone in front of Dominic with Elaine's message visible on the screen. It wasn't in Caruso's transfer. The 2021 restructuring put it outside the Harborview routing architecture. It's intact. The room did not move. Dominic looked at the phone, looked at it for a long time, reading, and she watched his face and saw the things she had been hoping for. Not relief exactly, not yet, but the first hairline shift in the compression that had been building since the parking structure, a slight change in the set of his jaw, the movement of a man who has been doing arithmetic and has just been handed a variable he hadn't included. How did you? He started. I read the 2021 amendments 3 years ago. You told me they weren't relevant. A beat. I kept them anyway. One of the men at the table, older, gray-haired, with the weathered authority of someone who has been in these rooms for 30 years, let out a long, slow breath and said very quietly, the Elara subsidiary. He looked at Dominic. If that's true, it's true, Nia said. She didn't look at the man. She looked at Dominic. Call Elaine. She has full documentation. She can have it secured and verified within the hour. Dominic was looking at her. The table, the room, the 8 men in their collectively held breath, all of it had receded from his attention, and what was left was just the look, the specific look she knew, the one that arrived when she had done something that recalibrated his understanding of her, which shouldn't have been possible after 7 years but continued to be, and each time it arrived, she felt it land somewhere deep and essential. He picked up the phone. Then the third door, not the one she'd entered through, a door at the far end of the room that she hadn't registered as a door, flush with the wall and painted to match, opened, and the man who came through it was not a member of any security team and was not someone whose name Nia knew and was not, as far as she could process in the half-second of recognition, someone who was supposed to be there. He was Dominic's age, maybe slightly younger. Dark eyes, a face that had been handsome and had had things happen to it since. He was wearing a jacket over a shirt that wasn't tucked in, and he was breathing with the rough cadence of someone who has been running or has been in a room with rising oxygen demand. And in his right hand he was holding a phone, and on the phone's screen, visible from where Nia stood because the image was large and the screen was bright in the dim room, was a photograph of Dominic and Nia, on the street outside the Grand Meridian Hotel tonight, with a timestamp. And beneath the photograph, in a text chain, a name that Nia recognized immediately and that she had no business recognizing in this room, in this context, in this photograph chain. The name was Marcus Webb, the student body president who had been standing in the circle at the reunion, who had told Dominic, apparently out of conscience or cowardice or some mixture of both, exactly what Vanessa had said about Nia, who had put his phone face down against his thigh when the notifications buzzed, who had, it now appeared, sent something to someone before he'd done any of that. The man with the unfamiliar face held the phone up and looked at Dominic and said 3 words, very quietly, that landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water, with an impact that starts small and moves outward in expanding rings that don't stop at the shore. Caruso knows everything. Dominic's hand tightened on the edge of the table. Not a large motion, just a white-knuckle compression of his fingers against the table's edge, the first visible external evidence of what was moving at a speed and scale below the surface of his composure, the first crack in the structure that had been holding since the parking structure. And before that, since the ballroom. And before that, since whenever he had first begun to understand that tonight was not going to be the night he thought it was going to be when he put on the black suit and the open collar shirt and drove to a hotel on Michigan Avenue to stand beside his wife. The reunion, Dominic said. Someone there was feeding him information in real time. The man with the phone moved toward the table, set the device down so the room could see it. Look at the timestamps. The first message went out at 9:04. That's before I walked in, Dominic said. Yes. So he knew I was there. He knew where you were and who you were with, and that the reunion gave him a... The man stopped, glanced at Nia, looked back at Dominic. A specific window, while your attention was somewhere else. Nia looked at the phone on the table, at Marcus Webb's name in the text chain. She thought about the circle of former classmates, about the phone face down against his thigh, about the expression she had read as guilty inventory, and which had been, she now understood, the expression of a man doing something else entirely, managing the awareness of what he'd already done. The tight thing in her chest had become something with teeth. She reached across the table, past two men who leaned back to make room without being asked, and she picked up the phone that the unfamiliar man had set down, and she looked at the full text chain, scrolling up, reading with the focus of a person who reads fast and retains everything, and the room waited around her with the patience of men who have learned that some moments require a specific silence. The chain went back 6 weeks. Marcus Webb had been in contact with Caruso's organization for 6 weeks. He hadn't known, when the contact began, that it would connect to Dominic. The first messages were about something else entirely, a business matter unrelated to anything in this room, the kind of peripheral contact that happens in a city where everyone who moves money knows someone who moves money. But 3 weeks in, the name Vescari appeared. And Marcus Webb, who had been the student body president at Lincoln Park Preparatory and who had spent 15 years building a business life in the same city as Dominic without their paths directly crossing, had looked at the name and made a decision. He had told them about the reunion. He had told them the date and the venue and that Dominic's wife would be there. He had not known, probably, the full implications of what he was providing, but he had provided it. For reasons that the text chain hinted at but didn't fully articulate, money most likely, or the threat of its absence, the particular vulnerability of a man whose business is performing better than its foundations and who needs a specific pressure relieved. It didn't matter why. The why would matter later, in a room where later things got addressed. Right now what mattered was that the reunion, the thing Nia had dreaded for 3 weeks, the thing she had almost not attended, the thing she had not told Dominic about until 4 days ago because she hadn't wanted to need him there, had been the mechanism. Not a coincidence, not simply a painful evening. A mechanism designed and timed and placed to move Dominic's attention at exactly the right moment. Nia set the phone down on the table. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she was not usually aware of it. Present and fast, beating against the inside of her chest with a regularity that felt effortful, as though her body were counting something. She was aware of Dominic looking at her, and of the 8 men in the room who were very carefully not looking at her, and of the specific silence of people who are in the presence of a realization arriving in real time and don't know which direction it will fall. She thought about the 4 days between when she'd told Dominic about the reunion and tonight. 4 days during which he had made phone calls and rearranged a schedule and organized security and arranged to arrive, because she had told him about a thing that was hard for her and he had decided, without being asked, to be there. 4 days during which someone had received that information from Marcus Webb and had assembled it into tonight's architecture. The reunion had not been a mistake. Attending had not been a mistake, but it had been the door, and she had opened it herself. "Dominic," she said. Her voice was steady in a way that cost her something. He looked at her. "I need you to hear me," she said. "Right now, before anything else happens in this room." She held his gaze and felt the 8 other men recede further, felt the room narrow to this single line of vision between herself and the man at the head of the table. "What happened tonight is not something I put on your back. Whatever they used, whatever door they went through, that is not a debt I owe you, and it is not a weight you carry because of me. You hear me? He was very still. "Because I know how your mind works," she said. "I know it's already running the calculation. Caruso said you went soft, and you're checking the math on that in the back of your head right now, even while you're looking at me, and I need you to stop." She took one breath. "Because the only thing that was ever true is that you are better with me than without me. Not weaker, better. And anyone who tells you otherwise is trying to separate you from the one person in this city who will not sell you to anyone under any circumstances at any price." She paused. "So don't let them." The room held its breath. Dominic looked at her for a long time. Then he said very quietly to the room in general, "Get Marcus Webb on the phone." One of the men at the table reached for his own device immediately. Another began typing. The man with the unfamiliar face moved toward the far door. The room reorganized around the new instruction with the speed of people who have been waiting for a directive and have now received one. Dominic pushed his chair back and stood, and he was the full version of himself now. Not the man who had pressed his mouth to Nia's forehead in the ballroom, not the man who had looked at her in the car with the look she'd had no name for, but the version that the city feared and that 12 years of Rafael Caruso hadn't been sufficient to prepare for. The version that had been built from everything it had survived and had not stopped surviving yet. He looked at Nia one more time, and what was in the look was complicated and layered and would take them both some time to fully excavate. But at the surface of it, visible and clear, was something she had seen before and would stake everything she had on the truth of the look of a man who has been reminded of what he is standing on and has found it. The look of a man who has been reminded of what he is standing on and has found it solid. That was the last thing Nia held on to as the room reorganized itself around the new directive. As phones came out and voices began the low, urgent work of men rerouting a crisis. As the fourth floor of the building on Lakeshore Drive became a different kind of room than it had been 20 minutes ago. Not a room absorbing a catastrophe, but a room responding to one, which is a different animal entirely, with different sounds and different air, and a different quality of attention from the people inside it. She found a chair against the wall, away from the table, and she sat in it and she stayed out of the way and she watched. This was something she had learned early in her years with Dominic, the specific discipline of knowing when your role is to act and when it is to witness, and of not confusing the two out of ego or anxiety. She had acted. She had called Elaine. She had read the text chain. She had said the thing she needed to say to Dominic's face, while 8 men sat at a table and pretended not to listen. Now the room needed to work, and her working inside it would create friction, and friction was a cost they couldn't afford tonight. So she sat, and she breathed, and she watched her husband rebuild. It took 4 hours. She knew it was 4 hours because she watched the clock on the wall above the door. A plain industrial clock, white face, black numbers, the kind that exists in rooms where time is tracked rather than experienced, move from 11:17 p.m. to 3:24 a.m. in increments that felt both very fast and geologically slow, depending on what was happening at the table at any given moment. Marcus Webb was reached by phone at 11:43. She could hear Dominic's side of the conversation from across the room. Not the words, but the cadence. Measured and quiet in the way that was most dangerous, the way that cost the person on the other end considerably more than a raised voice would have. The call lasted 9 minutes. When it ended, Dominic set the phone on the table and said 2 sentences to the man on his left, and that man made a call of his own, and the chain of consequence that had begun in a high school reunion ballroom began moving through its next set of chambers. Elaine Marsh called back at 12:31 with documentation on the Alara Group subsidiary that confirmed everything Nia had told the room. She heard the shift in the table's energy when the confirmation arrived. Not celebration, nothing so simple as that, but a specific change in the quality of the men's attention. The replacement of a particular dread with a particular focus, which is the closest thing to relief that rooms like this one produce. The Alara structure, intact and outside Caruso's reach, was not everything. It was not the full recovery of what had been taken. But it was the difference between a foundation and no foundation. And in a situation where someone has tried to remove the ground from under you, the discovery of ground you didn't know you were standing on is the difference between a catastrophe and a war. And these were men who knew how to fight wars. At 1:55 a.m., one of the men she didn't recognize made a phone call that lasted 30 seconds, and from the change in the room afterward, appeared to have located Rafael Caruso in a way that Caruso had not anticipated being located. She didn't ask how. She had long ago made a separate peace with the specific quality of not knowing that was required to be in Dominic's life, without being consumed by it. The understanding that there were rooms she was not in, and actions she did not witness, and consequences she would never have full visibility into, and that this was not a deficit in their relationship but a perimeter, and perimeters were not walls. At 3:24 a.m., the table went quiet in a different way. Dominic leaned back in his chair for the first time all night. Both hands came to his face, a brief double press of his palms against his eyes, and then they came down and he looked at the ceiling, and the look was not peace. Nothing about tonight was going to resolve into peace, not quickly. But it was the look of a man who has been running at maximum capacity for 4 consecutive hours and has reached the point where the immediate crisis is contained enough to allow his body to report what it has been spending. He looked tired, really tired, the kind that a night of sleep won't fix, that will live in him for days. The shadow along his jaw had deepened. His shirt was fully untucked now, and the sleeves were rolled to the elbows, and in the overhead light he looked his age in a way he rarely did, not diminished by it, but marked by it, carrying it visibly for the first time in a long night. He turned his head and looked at Nia across the room. She was still in the chair against the wall. She had taken her heels off somewhere around 1 a.m. and set them beside the chair and sat in her bare feet on the industrial carpet. Her small black purse was in her lap. She was alert. She had not slept, had not drifted, had sat in full attention for 4 hours. But she was also tired in a way that ran down to the cellular level, the accumulated weight of everything October 14th had required of her. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and the room between them was quiet. He stood up, said something brief to the man on his right, crossed the room toward her, and she stood when he got close because sitting while he was standing felt wrong in this moment, felt like the wrong physical arrangement, and she needed to be on her feet. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the full detail of his face, the exhaustion, and the something else beneath it that the 4 hours had not moved. "Come on," he said. "Let's go home." She picked up her heels. They left the building. The Suburban was still in the parking structure, still idling, a quality of mechanical patience that somehow felt almost generous at 3:30 in the morning. The driver opened the rear door without being asked. Nia got in. Dominic got in. The door closed. They moved through the city, which was a different city at this hour, emptied of its daytime self, running on skeleton systems, the sodium lights making everything look like a photograph of somewhere rather than the place itself. Chicago at 3 a.m. has a specific quality of held breath, of the city practicing for something, and Nia watched it move past the window and felt the distance between herself and the Grand Meridian Hotel, measured not in miles but in the specific accumulation of what had happened since she'd stood on the sidewalk in her wrong dress and looked up at the revolving doors. Dominic's hand found hers in the dark of the back seat. No announcement, just his hand, closing around hers, the specific warmth of it, and the slight roughness of the scar across his right index finger. She turned her hand over and held his back. They didn't speak for a long time. The city passed. The highway opened up north of the city. Fewer lights, faster road, the quality of the night becoming something more expansive, less contained. She leaned her head against the window glass and felt the vibration of the road through it and let herself, for the first time since she'd walked into the Grand Meridian Hotel, be something other than managed. She was angry. She identified it with some surprise because it had been living under the other things all night and had not fully surfaced until now. Not at Vanessa, not anymore, not even at Marcus Webb, though his name would carry a specific weight for a long time. She was angry at the architecture of it, at the fact that an evening she had dreaded for weeks, that she had almost not attended, that she had packed with the small, careful preparations of a person armoring themselves against a hard thing, had been converted, without her knowledge, without her participation, into a tool. That her history, the specific painful geography of her high school years, had been used as a distraction. That the thing that hurt had been the mechanism. There was something particularly violating about that. not the humiliation itself. She had stood inside the humiliation and held her ground, and she would stand inside it again if she had to, because she knew who she was, and 15 years had not changed that knowledge despite its best efforts. But the fact that her pain had been useful to someone, had been identified and calibrated and deployed. That was the thing with teeth. That was the thing that was going to take the longest to put down. She said this to Dominic somewhere on the highway. Not all of it, not the full architecture of it, but enough. She said, "The part I can't get past is that someone looked at what that place did to me and thought, yes, that's the lever." Dominic was quiet for a moment. Then, "Caruso is a man who looks for what people protect." "I know. He found what I protect." She looked at him in the dark. And he underestimated what he found. His hand tightened slightly around hers. He thought it was a soft place. He thought it would take my attention. A pause, short and precise. He didn't account for the fact that you were reading documents he didn't know existed. She breathed. That was luck. It wasn't luck. It was you. He turned his head toward her for the first time since they'd gotten in the car. In the dark, she could see his face only partially, the line of his jaw, the catch of light on his eyes, the particular tiredness that had settled into his features, not as defeat, but as the evidence of something spent. You read things nobody told you to read. You kept things nobody told you to keep. You called a lawyer at 11 o'clock on a Friday night and gave her the specific information she needed to find the one structure that was still standing. He paused. That's not luck, Nia. That's who you are. She looked out the window, the road, the dark fields north of the city, the sky beginning to hold the faintest possible suggestion of the idea of eventually becoming lighter, hours away still but present as a potential. Is it enough? She asked. What's left, the Alara structure, is it enough to rebuild from? It's enough to start. A pause. Starting is enough right now. She nodded. She accepted this because it was honest, and honesty at 3:45 in the morning on the highway after a night like this one was the only currency she had any use for. Marcus Webb, she said, is handled. What does that mean? It means he will spend a significant amount of time experiencing the consequences of his choices in ways that don't require my direct involvement. He said it without heat, without drama, with the flat factual delivery of a man stating a condition rather than making a threat. He made a calculation about who he could afford to involve and who he couldn't. He was wrong. He didn't know what he was doing, Nia said, not as a defense, as a fact. No, he knew exactly what he was doing. He just didn't know what it would cost. Dominic looked at the road ahead through the partition window. People like Marcus Webb always know what they're doing. They just fail to account for what happens when the person they've involved is someone who doesn't accept the framing that certain people are acceptable losses. She held that. And Caruso? A longer silence. The kind that means the answer is not simple or is not yet settled. Caruso is gone from the city, Dominic said finally. For now. What he moved. Not all of it stays where he put it. Some of it can be retrieved through channels he didn't close carefully enough because he was in a hurry. Some of it won't come back. A pause. Rafael Caruso has been in this business for 25 years, and he has never once moved against someone and been completely right about the outcome. Tonight, he got further than most. He didn't get everything. Because of the Alara group. Because of you, Dominic said, and said it with the specific quiet emphasis of a man who has no more patience for the distinction. They reached the house at 4:11 a.m. It was a house that sat back from the road behind trees that had gone gold and orange with October and were currently doing the full dark of pre-dawn without any color at all, just shapes and mass against the sky. She had loved the trees from the first time she'd seen them, before she loved much else about the place. Before it had become the specific particular home that it was now, weighted with the years and the specific objects and the arrangements of rooms that accumulate into the feeling of a life, being lived in a place rather than stored in it. She walked in barefoot, heels in her left hand. The entryway was dark, and she left it dark, didn't reach for the light. Dominic closed the door behind them, and she heard the specific sound of the lock and felt the architecture of the house settle around them, and she stood in the entryway in the dark for a moment and breathed. Dominic came up behind her. He put his hands on her shoulders, and she felt the weight of them, real, warm, familiar to the specific degree that familiarity becomes indistinguishable from foundation, and she let her own weight drop backward fractionally, not falling, just leaning into the presence of him. "I need to tell you something," he said from behind her. "Okay." "When I walked into that ballroom tonight," he stopped. She waited. "I was looking for you before I could see you. The room was big and there were a lot of people and I was scanning for you and I—" Another stop, briefer. "When I found you, across the room, I could tell from the way you were standing, before I could hear anything, before I got close enough to see your face. I could tell." She was quiet. "You were standing the way you stand when something is hitting you and you've decided not to let it move you. That specific stillness." His hands were gentle on her shoulders. "I know that stillness. I've watched you use it and I know what it costs." "It didn't cost me anything tonight," she said, and then amended, "It cost me less than it used to." "I know, but it cost something." His thumbs moved slightly, a small motion, less gesture than reflex. "I want you to know that I saw it, across a full ballroom. I saw it before I got to you." She put her hands over his on her shoulders, the scar on his right index finger under her fingers, the specific warmth. "I know you saw it," she said. "That's why I didn't fall apart when you got there." He pressed his mouth to the back of her head, brief and firm, the same way he had pressed it to her forehead in the ballroom. The same quality of gesture that was not performance but statement, the way Dominic made most of his statements. Through action rather than architecture, through the body rather than the speech. They stood like that for a while. The house was quiet around them. The particular quiet of a house at 4 a.m., when all its systems are at their most minimal. The refrigerator's low hum, the settling of the structure, the small sound of the trees outside moving in a wind that neither of them could feel from inside but could hear. Then she said, "I need to eat something." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, not yet. The night was still too close for the full thing, but the shape of one, the structure of it, the place where it would live once the distance was sufficient. "Kitchen," he said. They went to the kitchen. It was the same kitchen where, 3 years ago on a Tuesday night, she had told him about the east stairwell, and he had stood across the counter from her and understood something about her that he hadn't fully understood before. The counter where she had sat with coffee at 7 in the morning while he stood at the stove and refused to let anyone else make breakfast. The table where they had argued about small things and large things and the difference between the two. The window over the sink where the tree in the backyard was visible in all 4 seasons and had become, without either of them deciding it, a kind of domestic landmark. The measure of time passing, of things growing, of the specific evidence that life was accumulating rather than depleting. He made eggs. It was the one thing he cooked consistently, and without consulting anyone, the one domestic function he had claimed and defended across 7 years of a relationship with a woman who was considerably more competent in this room than he was. And she had always let him have it because she understood that it was not about the eggs. She sat at the table and watched him at the stove, and let herself do the thing she had been not doing all night. Let the full weight of it arrive. Not in pieces that could be managed, but as a totality. The reunion and the circle and Vanessa's voice shaping itself for the room. The ballroom doors opening, the young man through the side entrance. The parking structure and the call to a lane in the 4th floor. Marcus Webb's name in a text chain. Dominic's face across a table at 3 a.m. The Alara group and the thing that was still standing when everything else had moved. She let it all arrive, and she sat with it at the kitchen table, and she did not manage it or compress it or convert it into anything actionable. She just held it. The whole enormous complicated weight of October 14th in both hands, like water, like something that would be absorbed eventually, but for now was just there, present, requiring acknowledgement before it could diminish. Dominic set a plate in front of her, sat across from her. He had made coffee also, without her asking, the specific kind she drank at this hour. Not the strong version he preferred, but the milder version she switched to after midnight because she wanted the warmth without the acceleration. She picked up the fork. They ate in silence, and the silence was not empty. It was the kind of silence that has been earned, that exists between people who have moved through something significant together and don't need to narrate their arrival on the other side of it because they can both feel the ground under their feet. After a while, she said, "Vanessa apologized." Dominic looked up from his plate. "Before we left the hotel, she stopped me. She said she was sorry for tonight and for before." Nia looked at her coffee. "For all of it." "Did you believe her?" She considered this, the specific calibration of it, not whether the apology was performed or genuine, but whether it was sufficient, whether it could carry the weight of 15 years of accumulated wound, whether the woman who had looked at 14-year-old Nia in a hallway and chosen cruelty was the same woman who had looked at 33-year-old Nia in a ballroom and made the same choice again. And then, at the end of a night that had cost her considerably, found something different in herself. "I believed she meant it," Nia said. "I don't know yet if it matters. That's honest. That's all I've got right now." He nodded, drank his coffee. The kitchen light above them was warm in the way of kitchens at night, a small contained warmth, and outside the window the backyard was completely dark, and the tree was an indistinguishable part of the darkness, but she knew it was there. "She was afraid of you," Dominic said, "in high school. You walked through the hallway and you didn't look at her. She told you that tonight." "She told me that. People who are afraid of what they don't control try to control it." He said it without particular wisdom delivery, just observationally, the way you note the weather. "She couldn't control whether you cared what she thought, so she made caring what she thought the price of existing in that space. For everyone else it worked." He looked at Nia across the table. "For you it didn't, because you'd already decided something about yourself that didn't leave room for her version." Nia looked at him. "I was scared every single day." "I know. I practiced a face in the mirror every morning for 3 years, to look like I wasn't." "I know that too. So it's not that I was immune, it's that I was refusing," he said. "There's a difference." She sat with that. The distinction between immunity and refusal, between not feeling the weight and choosing to carry it rather than set it down in the specific way that other people wanted you to set it down, which was at their feet, as tribute. She had not been immune to Vanessa Caldwell or to any of them. She had been 14 years old and she had been afraid, and she had hurt in the specific articulate way of a young person who understands exactly what is being done to them and cannot stop it. But she had decided in some part of herself that she hadn't had language for at the time and still didn't entirely, that she was not going to give them the satisfaction of the full collapse, that she would be afraid alone in the stairwell and would not be afraid in the hallway, that the face in the mirror was not a performance of strength, but the practice of it, the daily repetition that builds the thing into the muscle until it becomes actual. And it had become actual. Not easily, and not without cost, and not in a way that left her invulnerable. Tonight had demonstrated that clearly enough, but it had become actual. The woman who had stood in the ballroom circle while Vanessa catalogued her insufficiencies for an audience was not the same woman who had practiced a face in the mirror, except in the one way that mattered. The decision, made at 14 to refuse, had become the decision, made at 33 to refuse, and the refusal had deepened rather than eroded. That was the thing Caruso had miscalculated, not just tactically, not just in the arithmetic of accounts and structures. He had looked at the woman beside Dominic Vescari and seen a soft place, a lever, a distraction. He had not seen what she was, what she had been built into by the specific pressure of everything that had tried to unmake her. You did not move Nia Brooks Vescari by making her feel small. You had tried that. 15 years of people had tried that. It produced a woman who had read documents nobody told her to read and kept them for 3 years and used them at midnight to save the one thing still standing. Caruso had moved against the wrong, soft place. She finished her eggs, set the fork down, picked up the coffee with both hands and felt the warmth of the cup against her palms, and looked at the window over the sink where the backyard was dark and the tree was invisible but present. "It's going to be a long few months," she said. "Yes." "Rebuilding the structure." "Yes." "And Caruso?" "Caruso is not finished," Dominic said. "Not threatening, not posturing, just accurate. He got further tonight than he will again. He doesn't know yet what didn't move when he pushed. When he finds out—" He paused.
It will change his calculation. And Marcus Webb's calculation is already changed. Yes, she nodded slowly. The coffee was the right temperature now, that specific window between too hot and merely warm where it was exactly what it was supposed to be. She drank it and felt it move through the specific tiredness that had settled into her bones over the course of the night and found what remained of her warmth and supplemented it. "I'm not going to lie," she said. "The part where half the room laughed while Vanessa called me a fat black woman is going to live in me for a while." Dominic said nothing. He looked at her steadily. "Not the way it used to," she said. "Not like debt. More like something that reminds me what the world does with certain people's pain when it thinks nobody important is watching." She set the cup down. "I want to remember that. I don't want to forgive it so completely that I forget what it showed me about those people." "Then remember it," he said. "You're allowed to remember." "I know." She looked at him. "I'm also allowed to forgive. I haven't decided which of those things I'm doing yet with Vanessa. Maybe both, maybe in that order. You'll know when you know?" "I will." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, somewhere distant, the first bird began. Not dawn yet, but the practice of it, one bird in the tree or near it, testing the darkness with a single repeated note that said, "Not morning, yet but coming, coming," the way all things that are coming announce themselves to those still awake enough to hear. Dominic reached across the table and picked up her hand. Not with ceremony, just picked it up the way you pick up something that belongs in your hand, naturally, without the awareness that it is an action because it has become too much a part of how things are to register as a choice. She looked at his hand around hers, the scar, the knuckle. 7 years of this hand and she still noticed it, which she had decided was either evidence that she was paying close enough attention or evidence that some things don't become ordinary no matter how continuous they are, and she had further decided that both of those things were the same thing. "Go to sleep," he said. "You too. After I make some calls. Dominic. 1 hour, then I'll sleep." He squeezed her hand once and let it go. "I promise." She stood. She was so tired that the standing itself was a negotiation between her and gravity. She picked up her heels from where she'd left them at the base of the chair, and she stood in her bare feet on the kitchen floor at 4-something in the morning and looked at her husband at the table, tired and real and complicated, and hers, the man who had put 12 bodyguards in a hotel ballroom and crossed the room without looking at anyone else because she was the fixed point. And she held the image of him for a moment in the specific interior way you hold things you want to keep. Then she said goodnight, and she went upstairs. The bedroom was dark and cool and smelled like the specific combination of the room itself and the night air that had come through the window they'd left cracked before they'd gone out tonight, hours ago, which felt like a different lifetime, which in some sense it was. She closed the window and stood by the bed and set her heels on the floor and looked at the ceiling in the dark. The ceiling was the same ceiling it always was. This was, right now, the most stabilizing fact she possessed. She lay down on top of the covers in her dress, the wrong dress, the thin October dress that had let the cold through from the start, and she stared at the ceiling and listened to the distant single bird and thought about what she would say to Vanessa Caldwell if she ever saw her again in a room where nobody was performing for anyone. She thought she would say something true. Something that didn't require the audience or the ballroom or the ring on her hand or the man who would walk through any door she was standing behind. Something from before any of that. From the girl in the east stairwell with her mother's blouse and her practiced face, the girl who had decided something about herself in a space nobody else could see and had held it across 15 years of other people's definitions and come out the other side still in possession of the original decision. She thought she would say, "I never needed you to believe in me. I only needed to believe in myself until I had the evidence." And then she thought she might not say anything at all, because the life she was living was the thing that had already said it. And some arguments are won not by the last word but by the accumulation of days, the simple, irrefutable evidence of a person who did not break, who went on, who built something from the materials that were available, which were considerable because she had always been more than the room's accounting of her. And she had always known it, and the knowing in the end had been enough. She closed her eyes. The bird outside went on counting the dark. Somewhere downstairs, Dominic was on the phone, making the calls that would begin the long work of what came next. The months of reconstruction and reckoning.
the settling of accounts that tonight had displaced, and the opening of accounts that tonight had revealed, the ongoing, complicated, difficult, particular work of being who they were in the world they actually lived in, rather than the world that was simpler. She was not afraid of that work. She had been afraid of the wrong things for long enough to have learned the difference between a fear that is telling you something and a fear that is only the echo of something old. Someone else's voice, learned so young it sounds like your own, saying you are not enough for this room, this man, this life. She had carried that voice for a long time, and she had set it down somewhere between the east stairwell and the kitchen table at 4 a.m., not in one moment and not without difficulty, but incrementally, decision by decision, day by ordinary day, until the voice was thin enough that she could hear under it clearly and without effort the other thing. Her own voice, the actual one, the one that had been there first and had never stopped being there, the one that had said, at 14, in a mirror in a bathroom before school, "You are going to be fine." It had been right. She slept.